Once again, we're hearing from the epistle of 1 Thessalonians that Paul wrote to this community. And he talks in metaphor about wearing armor, about a breastplate and a helmet. This is interesting, fascinating, colorful language, and we should dive into it. But first, a recap. We're talking about epistles. Epistles are letters. They're personal correspondences between the Apostle Paul and the communities that he had planted in Europe and the Middle East. They were the first Christian communities a decade or two after Christ rose back to heaven. Paul wrote a ton of these letters. He would sit and write words of encouragement and hope to the communities that were struggling in their day. His message could always be boiled down to, everything is going to be okay. It always came back to that. Everything is going to be okay. But why did they need to hear that so much back in the 1st century AD? What was so pressing, what was so dire, that Christians in Thessalonica needed to hear this? Let's explore that first. Thessalonica, what a beautiful place. A city on the sea in Macedonia, which is modern-day Greece. It was a center of commerce and a bustling economy. It was wonderful. But just like a place can be a center of commerce, it can also be a center of culture. And this is no different. Thessalonica was a party city. People loved to have fun and party. They would get together, they would stay up late at night, they would drink to excess. It's no wonder that they did, though, because of the religion that was prevalent in Thessalonica. The god that they worshipped in this Greek city was the god Dionysus, the god of wine. Wine that flows, wine that keeps you late at night drinking into excess. But he wasn't just the god of wine, he was also the god of fruit, and fertility, and insanity, and festivals, and madness, and theater. A very eccentric character, Dionysus, and maybe not a person that we should seek to emulate all the time. But this was the culture of Thessalonica. It was a party city, like Ames or something, I don't know. But then there was another element there as well. There was an Orthodox Jewish element that sought to keep observant Jews in line. These people who worshipped God from a distance, who were not in Jerusalem, were called the diaspora. They're basically nomadic Jews, settled in a land that is away from the motherland. And so wherever Christian communities would be settled, they would usually be close to these Jewish communities because the first Christians didn't see any difference between themselves and Jews. And sometimes these Jewish communities would seek to persecute these Christians for wrong belief. In fact, Paul, who wrote this epistle, was one of those Jews when he started, when his name was Saul. And he actually saw to the martyrdom of the apostle Stephen. Now, warning, caution alert. Let's not go overboard here. It is not unusual for Christians to read the epistles of Paul and the Gospels and come away from it thinking Jews are bad. It's called anti-Semitism, and it's not okay. It's not the right way to read these scriptures. The people who are criticizing the Jewish faith in here aren't necessarily criticizing it as a whole, but they are criticizing this one violent, tiny sect of it. I'm not saying this hypothetically. This happened. It happened quickly after the scriptures were written. Marcion of Sinope was the first such theologian who sought to make the scriptures anti-Semitic. In his opinion, the God of the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh, was not the same God as the New Testament. And so he says we need to get rid of the whole New Testament. But also, we need to get rid of all the Gospels except Luke, and then some of Paul's letters. Only the letters that mention how bad Jewish people are. And because of his heresy, the church got together for the first time and called him a silly goose, and they're like, you need to get out of here, right? I digress. There's a third element also in Thessalonica. Thessalonica was a Roman province, a valuable Roman province. In Roman provinces, especially those of commerce and culture, Roman magistrates and Roman soldiers would constantly be vigilant to look for insurrection. So when Christians would trot out and say, hey, it's Jesus, our Lord. Or, hey, we're going to be part of the empire of heaven. It sounds like insurrection to me, and so you got to root it out. So Christians in Thessalonica lived in this weird triad of pressure. On the one hand, there was excessive pleasures, the temptation to put yourself into those situations where you find yourself in a state of constant drunkenness and constant self-pleasure. There was religious extremism that sought to kill them for their non-compliance to what they believed was right belief and right faith. And finally, there was government persecution. There was the Roman government that sought to quash any talk of hope, any talk of rising up. In the middle, Thessalonica, Thessalonian Christians. Paul talks to the Thessalonians and uses one word very frequently. He uses the word trials. You guys are going through trials. You can expect to have trials. These trials will be difficult. The Greek word that he uses here is thlipses. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't care. Thlipses can be translated to trials. It can also be translated to pressure. Imagine the pressure surrounding you. You're called to a life of temperance, a life of prayer, a life of quiet, and yet everyone around you is calling for you to give it up, either to drunkenness and excessive pleasures and hedonism, or to right faith like you were raised in, or to be compliant with law. All of these things can be overwhelming. And what do you do in the face of overwhelming odds? What kind of people persevere through this? Military people. That's the kind of people, it's the kind of culture that these people would understand. It's the kind of culture Paul would know. Everyone knew about the Roman military, and so Paul uses that imagery of military language to tell them to persevere, to encourage them, to let them know everything's going to be okay. Paul loves talking about military stuff. He talks about it constantly through his letters and his epistles about wearing the armor of God and wearing, the helmet and the breastplate and the belt and the gauntlets and all the stuff, right? And so people were to be prepared like an army surrounded at all sides, that things looked hopeless, but suddenly they knew that one day, very soon, they would see over the hills, Jesus would be waiting there, riding, ready to provide reinforcement. Everything was going to be okay. It was going to be okay soon. That's what Paul's trying to echo here. But when it comes to military stuff, sometimes Christians misunderstand what this means. The first Christians were pacifists. They didn't believe in violence, even to the extreme where someone would kill them where they stood and they would offer no resistance, because they knew that Jesus was coming and that they would be raised and everything was going to be okay. They also had no armory. They didn't really have armor. Why would we need it? Jesus is on his way back. They had no military agenda. To be great to these people was not to be fierce, was not to be violent, was not to conquer or succeed in an earthly way. It was to do so in a spiritual way. They were not people of violence. And Paul even says that. In the very next verse, after talking about the armor of God, he says, "For God has destined us not for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ." Not for wrath. That's a hard thing to grapple with, especially when you're frustrated, under pressure, and angry, and who could blame you if you act out? Don't we find ourselves frequently in places of frustration and anger and pressure, especially as we find ourselves in circumstances that we can't control? We like to pretend that we can control so much, but right now, things certainly seem hopeless, careening, like there's no reprieve, no reinforcement coming. In our culture, we often look at the breastplate of temperance, breastplate of love, and instead choose the other path of consumerism, regardless of the way it deteriorates the people who are caught up in the supply chain or the world that we share. Sometimes we look at the armor of love and instead beat our chests with violent sentiments, the opposite of mercy. Sometimes we look at the helm of salvation and choose instead for that which rips salvation and hope away from people. It's hard living for justice. It's hard living for hope or to have peace. None of this is easy. To succumb to these ways that we know to be, these ways we were raised, is like a comfy recliner sometimes. It conforms to the shape of our body. It is familiar. It is what we know. And once we sit down in it, it is so hard to stand back up again. This is not the chair necessarily that Paul hopes for his church. He hopes instead for this kind of chair. This kind of chair will give you discomfort. This kind of chair will make you sweat. You can't lounge in this chair, but it will make you stronger. The Christian path is hard. There's no denying that. To be moderate in how we enjoy ourselves, to be resistance to the forces that would see injustice in the world, to be that kind of religion that is not violent, that is not insistent upon its rightness, but instead loving in its kindness. It's not easy, and it can certainly seem like there's no hope at the end of it. But Paul reminds us that there is. And in fact, the hope that we see at the end of this Christian road is greater than any joy, than any luxury we could ever experience in this world. The drunkenness and the late nights and the falling in line with injustice, it's easy and it feels good for the right now. But we're not called to live in the right now. We're called to live in the hope that Christ is coming back, that Christ loves us. And in the meantime, we arm ourselves with the armor of God.